Marco, welcome back to 10% True.
Hey, Steve. Good to see you again.
So this is interview number three. For anybody who hasn't seen the other two, watch them because that will help add some context to the things that we're about to talk about. So after our second hour and 45 minutes of chatting, we got to the
Yeah.
point where you're still flying the Eagle at Mountain Home as part of the 390th Fighter Squadron. Um,
Mm.
you mentioned that off camera that you'd done a WSEP, which is a Weapon Systems Evaluation Program.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little about that? What is that? What's the purpose, and what was your experience?
Yeah, sure. It was after my second deployment to Middle East, which was over in Bahrain, and we did AEF 7. So we'd kind of gone back to back to back deployments from 97 and 98. And so actually, this was near the end of my time before I left to go to Kadena. But we got picked up for WESUP slot. So that is the uh, weapons something employment program, standards and employment program, I think. Basically, what it is an opportunity to go down to Tyndall and fly out over the Gulf Range and shoot live weapons. And so, not necessarily with warheads, although they do that too. Mostly that goes out of Eglin, but shoot different weapons and at different type targets. Sometimes you get to shoot full scale drones like an F4 or by the time I was there, F-16s, shooting down an F-16, which is kind of weird. Or in my case, I shot at a subscale drone with a heat canisters on the wingtip. So I was actually the first one in the squadron for a live shot on that deployment, and we went down. And you have a couple of days where you just fly local area in Tyndall to get used to the airspace and just one or two flights, and then we went up to shoot the missile. So for me, it was an AIM-9, which was really cool. I kind of asked to shoot an AIM-9 for a couple of reasons. One is you're up in close, and I wanted to be close to the target to see that. And then second, it's mounted on the pylon, so it fires from the jet instead of being like an AIM-120 or an AIM-7 that are fuselage mounted to kind of get pushed off and then light. So I wanted to have the experience of it, firing off the jet. And so anyway, got to go do that. And so we took off, and basically you have a chase guy from the WSEP squadron who's a safety observer and helps set it up. But we're out headed westbound out into the Gulf, and the drone is already airborne, and it's coming opposite direction. So you pick it up on the radar, do a little stern conversion on it, and when you get basically beak to beak, it starts a 4G turn. So it's pretty predictable. It's a pretty predictable platform, but you come around and then hammer down. So for mine was actually I don't know if the guy was not paying attention or what, but I'm switches are hot. I'm ready to fire. So I call, hey, I think it was once hot and nothing. So I call it again, and finally he says clear to shoot, and I hammer down, and right as I push the pickle button, I get a break X in the HUD, and I'm like, oh crap! I think I might have shot inside break X, but you get the big bang. Man, it was incredible. Just a boom on the left wing. So I was in a left hand 4G turn, get the bang on the left side, and then the missile comes off, and I see it's coming down at the target, and actually hits it. It hits the right wing of the drone, and blows the heat sensor off the tip of the wing. And so we come off and come back, and so that was it. It's pretty fast. I mean, it's push the button, big bang, whoosh, and it's over. Little smoke trail. But then you go back and review the tapes and see what you did. Look at your intercept and look at the shot. And so I was happy as I reviewed my film that it was 2 frames prior to break X when the witness mark came up on the film. So I wasn't inside min range. And we had a hit. So they have telemetry on the missile. They can tell, that it hit. There was the missile fused, right? And as I said, it kind of knocked the heat sensor right off the right wingtip of the missile of the drone. And it was a sidewinder, so I really kind of learned why they call it that. Because obviously, if I have a 4G turn, I fire, the missile goes under the jet, curls up, and it comes through back into the HUD field of view from above and to the right of me. So as it's coming down into the target, so it circled like a big corkscrew into the target. But yeah, it was amazing. And I kind of always have said the feeling of it is like, you shoot a shotgun or something, you feel that recoil in your shoulder. It feels like that, except it's the whole jet. The whole jet kind of goes boom. And so it's not long, but just you can definitely feel it. And so that was pretty cool.
Did you fire an AIM-9X, or was it an L or an M?
No, it was a Mike -8. So yeah, AIM-9 Mike -8. That was 98. So we didn't have X's yet, except they probably did over in test side, or we're testing them, but we didn't have them yet. So yeah, it was just a AIM-9 Mike.
So from these, from the Air Force's perspective, then, I mean, I guess anybody who wonders whether or not it's a bit wasteful to do this stuff. what are the advantages to the pilot?
Well, I mean, getting that feel and the adrenaline rush to actually hit the pickle button. For me, I mean, I think for a young guy who'd never maybe done and dropped anything live before, it might be more important. But I think in back a couple of weeks ago, we were in number 1. Remember, I talked about the first time I actually popped off a flare in combat at night by accident. That, I think if it would have been an AIM-9 Mike, it would have been scarier. So that it was more than the flare at night feeling. So I think it was good to feel that and to kind of just get that first time over with, so you're not concerned about it. Again, I'd been in combat already twice, in the F-111, and then twice in the Eagle. So it wasn't like, I had never kind of done stuff, but it was impressive, and I was glad to have done it. A lot more than, like, I think we talked about it a little bit. I shot rockets. Maybe I don't remember if we talked about it. In the AT-38, we had the Su-20 pod and the gun pod. We also shot rockets occasionally, 2.7 rockets. And I shot a rocket out of a T-38, and it was way more than that. So it was quite a bit more than a rocket, a 2.75 millimeter rocket.
I think the Air Force also, it uses stuff that's going to be time expired, doesn't it? So it will take something that if you don't use it now, it probably won't work if you
right.
use it later.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a little different when you go out to the airplane and you have an actual missile. Now, it didn't have a warhead, as I mentioned, but it's got the full-up seeker that's going to be timed out, and then the rocket motor, which is time limited in lifespan. And then the fins are different on a live one. They actually have some rollers that help stabilize, and then of course they're all movable because it guides. So it's different than the ones we carry for training that really are just kind of a shape with the nose on it, because we do use the seeker mechanisms in training every day. They just don't have warheads or the missile body. So it's not a different seeker. It's the same one we train with all the time. But the rest of it, everything behind the seeker, was different, and workable except for the warhead.
Do you feel pressure going out and doing a shot like that?
A little bit. Yeah, you don't want to screw it up. Again, wasteful. Some might say it's wasteful to shoot the missile. It's even more wasteful if you screw it up. So yeah, you want to make sure you do the right thing, and that's why my initial, like, oh crap, I shot at break X, was there. It wasn't that. I saw it hit, so I know, hey, if I was inside break X, it still worked. So maybe that's a data point that we would learn from. But it was absolutely min range, and it hit. So it was a good validator for me that you can shoot it right at very minimum range, and it's going to operate exactly how it's supposed to, and hit the target. So that was a good thing to see in real life and learn. That it absolutely works, and it kind of almost in a good operational flow. I mean, I wasn't at high G, but I was in a 4.5, 5 G left-hand turn when I fired it, so it wasn't just straight and level doing nothing. It was had some G on the jet, and everything worked perfect.
Yeah, you mentioned data points. I remember talking to somebody about the way that sometimes they shoot these aim sevens at WSEP, where
Mm.
and there is a fairly well-known picture, I think, of 4 strike eagles all together firing aim sevens at the same time. And as I understand it, they'll test different profiles. So those missiles will each have a slight. So one might loft, the other might go direct,
Right.
and they do get telemetry and data points out of the performance of those different profiles as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, it's another justification for going out and doing these things.
Yeah, every time you shoot it, we get more information on it. So yeah, that's a very, very valid point. And we do that at WSEP. All that data is collected. It's not lost. So again, you don't just go out and shoot them for fun. There's a lot of information gained by the pilot as well as the Air Force overall.
So speaking things quite nicely then into a segue, but of things that are done with the intention of helping you guys as fighter pilots experience things outside of combat that you're going to experience inside of combat. Tell us a bit about Red Flag and your experience going to Nellis.
Yeah, and I think, again, I kind of mentioned when in the 111 timeframe that I did the TLP course instead of going to a Red Flag in the 111, because I figured, if I flew fighters long enough, that would come up. And so it did. When I was at Mountain Home, we got the chance to go to Red Flag. And for us, it was pretty close. And we actually took most of the wing. And there was also other guys there. There always is. But it's a 2.5, almost 3 week deployment down to Nellis. And the intent of Red Flag is to give you your first, 5 or 10 actual kind of combat sorties to get you that stress, high level amount of stress, and against a realistic threat in a pretty realistic scenario. And so that, again, I think going to Red Flag after, my 4th combat tour, for me was, I wouldn't say anticlimactic, because it wasn't. But I went there asking myself, is this going to do what they think it's supposed to do? In being very realistic and actually kind of giving you that level of, I guess, amped up feeling that they're kind of trying to generate. And I think largely it did. For us, it was a night flag mostly. The first week we did a couple of day sorties, day familiarization for the range and to know the airspace. And then I flew 1 day sortie the first week as a flag exercise, and that one was pretty exciting because you can it's more fluid, I guess, during the day, because at night there is safety rules in peacetime. So we have decks that we have to stay inside of, so you don't go blitzing through the sky and into somebody else's altitude block. That could be a factor at night where you didn't see them or something. So it is a little more maybe controlled at night, but during the day it's pretty crazy, all altitude war with a lot of airplanes out there. And so my day flight, what I would say was pretty exciting. And because of the combat missions I did on my 2 deployments in the Eagle, we didn't have any bad guys actually to fight. It was scarier than combat in some ways. So in that respect, I think it did what it's supposed to do, is really get you that level of anxiety to some extent, and a fluid environment with a lot of threats, because they also have a lot of emitters. They have the ground threats going on. They have smoky SAMs that they actually shoot, so you see things actually come off the ground. And they have actual emitters that are going to run your RWR scope and give you the sounds and the inputs that are real in your system. So you're going to get a lot more of that. Plus, you always have AWACS or GCI. So basically all the pieces are there. And so it was a great experience. And the Mountain Home Eagles are our C models out of Mountain Home. We did really well while we were there. Had a 24-to-1 kill ratio at Red Flag.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. I was reading a piece by Dave Depchula, the general, well-known general, on the internet this week, where he was talking about how the F-35 had done well at Red Flag because it had a 20-to-1 kill ratio.
Yeah.
So you guys did exceptionally well. can we talk a little bit about that process then? For anybody not familiar with it, is there real-time kill removal? Do you regenerate? Can you explain those things, those concepts? What does it look like?
For the Blue Air side, I don't think we were allowed to regenerate, but the Red Air does. So they're F-16s back then. Now they have actually some Red Air Eagles that have joined in. But back then I think they had some F-5 still, but a lot of the Bandits were F-16s. And so they're pretty, again, formidable aircraft out there. It's not just a toy that you're playing against. But yeah, after you killed them, they could go back and regenerate. And basically what they would do is depart down low and go back and come from one of the bad guy bases. So there was bad guy bases kind of back in the target area. So the whole flow at Red Flag is almost always the same. You basically come in what they call Student Gap, which is over on the east side of the range, and the blue side flows west. And there's strike targets that they actually drop during Red Flag. They'll drop sometimes training or heavyweight or live ordnance there. And those target areas are in behind what would be a border of the other country. And so when they regenerate, they come from the airfield area back in bad guy land. So it's not just, go back and tag a point and come back. It's actually more realistic than that. They regenerate from airfield areas that are on the simulated map. So yeah, they can regenerate multiple times depending on how fast you kill them. But yeah, we were able to, we did great. I was a 2-ship flight lead at Red Flag. I hadn't finished 4-Flug yet. I guess it was before my second deployment then, because I was a 4th ship when we went to Bahrain. So yeah, I guess it was in between. Anyway, I was flying as an element lead, and I never lost a wingman, and I never got killed. So we shot a lot of missiles and got a lot of good training, and like I said, I never lost. My element never lost. So it was, I don't know, I guess, is it good to never lose? Maybe. I think we did really well.
You mentioned last time around, being in sort of big dogfights, and I think the expression you used was flush out, so leave those and come back in and rebuild your SA, and how that was sometimes quite a scary experience. When you said that you were more frightened, well, not frightened, but you were, it elicited more sort of fear in you in Red Flag that they're going up against the Iraqi Air Force in Southern Watch. Are those the incidents that you're referring to? Those the sorts of things you're referring to?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, when you get in those big package operations, because especially in an all-altitude war like at Red Flag, and sometimes we had these happen down at Hill Air Force Base. I mentioned we would go down to Hill or over to Fallon and work with the Navy. So we do a lot of big package ops in those exercises or in those goes. And so when you're doing an all-altitude war and you're kind of ending up sometimes down at low altitude where everybody else is, there's tons of people down there. The Eagles we like to be up in the 30s. And really the F-15 was designed to never lose at that altitude. So there was nothing that could turn with us above 25, 30,000 feet. I mean, we were just, Godzilla up there. But once you came down low, there's a lot of people who can turn, and thrust isn't really a factor, So when you get down into the 5,000 foot area, 5 to 10,000 feet, and everybody's flying all over the place, it can get kind of crazy. And at Red Flag, I saw that because at Red Flag we could go all the way down to low at. So we're down on the deck sometimes, 1,000 feet, and now you're running around with the dudes who are flying low level too, right? So there's all kinds of people down there, and you gotta keep your melon on a swivel and make sure you're not going to run into anybody while you're running a sort or trying to chase somebody down. And sometimes it could be a slow speed guy too. We did some stuff at Red Flag during our day sorties. There were C-130s that were acting as transports, bad guy transports that we would needed to pop them to if we saw them. And so now you kind of go down there, and I think we talked a little bit about the VID stuff before too, and sometimes we were forced by the ROE of red flag for those guys. We had to go look at them. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and a lot of airplanes out there. So it gets sometimes it gets a little dicey.
So VID. Speaking of which, obviously generally the Eagle community is good at that, but there were, I think it was 94. There was that notorious incident where 2 Black Hawks were shot down, by some Eagles and mistaken VID. How much time do you spend looking at pictures of aircraft and doing your visual recce training, for want of a better word?
Yeah, a lot, and that happened after I was done at Kadena. And I knew some of those guys that were involved in that. I knew both of the guys. One of them, he was going into the AT-38 at Randolph, and I ran into him and talked to him about it. Anyway, the problem with the pictures, rather than seeing the actual airplane, sometimes is paint schemes are different, or that shoot down of the Blackhawks was a colossal amount of different errors, including they weren't squawking, they weren't supposed to be there. AWACS didn't know they were there. AWACS didn't say, hey, there might be somebody there, even though they actually were talking to them or had talked to them. So there was a colossal amount of errors involved in that, not just the actual guys that push the pickle button, although they're ultimately responsible because they're the ones that let the weapon go. But yeah, they saw, based on all of their other SA, and we talked about SA, when you think you have it but you don't, and that was, I think, one of those situations. They felt like they had exhausted all the different thoughts of could friendlies be there, and then they saw kind of what they expected to see, or they made it match up. And they had never seen pictures of Black Hawks with external tanks, which have the little winglets and tanks on the outside, that made them look a lot like a Soviet helicopter. So there were a lot of errors in there. But yeah, even before that happened, we would get tested routinely on VIDs, on silhouettes and pictures, and we'd be back in the vault going through those all the time, and we had routine tests on that. So it was a big part of it, and I would hope if I was in the same situation that I wouldn't have pushed the button, but I don't know. I couldn't tell you for sure.
I mean, I didn't go into this interview intending to talk about this, but it just came to mind. Can you expound a little bit on how the Eagle community handled that event then? And look, it's, you can just decline to answer, but I'm curious to know whether or not, those two, individuals were demonized or ostracized by the Eagle community. I mean, was there some sympathy for them?
Yes, I think there was a lot of sympathy for them. We all kind of felt like I just said, I don't know what I would have done if I was in the jet, but I can't say that I wouldn't have done the same thing. So it wasn't nobody thought it was malicious intent. That was pretty obvious, and so we did. There was a lot of sympathy for them, and to be honest, I think that the Air Force was handling it pretty well until we got a new chief of staff that wanted to make an example of it, and ended up court-martialing the captain. And actually, that's when I ran into him. It wasn't kind of when that was starting to come up, and because of that, before that they'd said you couldn't fly Eagles anymore, and that's why he was going to the AT-38. And during that process, he was pulled out of training for the AT-38. And they basically said, no, you can't even fly anything related. And matter of fact, you might not fly ever again. So we felt, to be honest, I think it was a mistake with a ton of causal factors that ultimately led to to the action. But I don't think that the Air Force necessarily, and the end result of the way they handled it was the best. For the Air Force, I think it made a lot of people gun shy and probably second guess things that would be valid later. You don't want to do that.
I think in aviation parlance, sometimes people refer to all of the holes in the cheese lining up. If they all line up, then something bad happens, and that was an example of that.
Yeah, sure was.
Did he go on, the captain? Because I know the and their names are on the internet, but we won't mention them. But did the captain go on and get continue a flying career outside the Air Force, or?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't know him well, and I'm not sure what happened after that. I went to do some other stuff, and I didn't keep tracks.
Okay. One thing I was going to ask you, and this might, maybe we'll defer the answer to later on in the conversation because we're going to talk about training. But you talked about one of the advantages then of something like red flag in that it's sort of triggering your radar warning receiver and giving you an opportunity to see what that looks like and all the sounds and beeps and all that stuff. Is synthetic capability in the cockpit something that could sort of replicate that? So if you look at modern fast jet trainers, typically they'll have a radar display. The guy in the back seat can make targets appear on the radar. They can make the raw ping, do all those sorts of things. Is that something that would do a decent job, or could do a decent job of actually meaning that you don't have to do things like red flag anymore?
I think maybe when part of the stuff I was doing, and this is post-retirement, but I was working military stuff still here at Eglin and with Eglin and with the Gulf range out here, which is a national asset for what we can do. But part of the stuff that they were talking about with the F-22 and the F-35 is getting sensors set up so that they could actually, not sensors, but emitters, so that they could train against emitters. And so I don't know if you can do it synthetically as much as put them in certain places where you can brief and say, well, I know the threats are going to be in these kind of areas as I go into the target, and now they actually work, so I can react, and that reaction is going to force me to do something that is in relation to the target. Now, can you synthetically add that? Probably. I know that when I was at GIFCOM, which again was ways down from where we are now, we were working on those live, basically combining live, simulated, and some synthetic all together, where maybe some of the guys are in the simulator, some were in the air, and then some of them are just computer generated. And that kind of fusion of different training types, I think, is good. We did in the F-15 and in other airframes, simulators that were tied together, that were visual. And so that actually is really good training. And so can you tell if it's real or not? Maybe. But I mean, there's a difference in when you're in Iraq than when you're in Las Vegas, right? Because it's actually, yes, I'm going to train and I'm going to hear it and it's real and it's the right sound and it's the right symbology on my scope. But I still know it's not going to kill me, right? So there's a difference, I think, in that respect. And when you're in a simulator, I hit the ground a lot in the simulator. I've never hit the ground in an airplane. So I think that's, the fact the I still need to survive factor doesn't really exist the same way in a simulated environment. And I think that could be something we could talk about more in the training section too.
Okay. One final question about red flag.
Okay.
I do remember, I can't remember where I heard it. I was maybe interviewing one of the early aggressors or talking to somebody who worked at the ranges there, and certainly through the 80s, there being an awareness that there were probably Russian assets locally who were sampling the air for electromagnetic signals and so on and so forth. And obviously, one of the things that you have in the aeroplanes is the radar and certain other electronic emissions. Are you required to sort of keep some of that stuff to a minimum? Are there bits that you're told not to use in order that people don't get a trace on what the signals look like, or whatever?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. The truth is we were sometimes worried about the French. Are they collecting, when we're flying against Mirage 2000s, are they collecting more than they're learning? So there's yes, we were cognizant of where we were and what potential collectors could be out there, and we did pay attention to that.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you. I won't press you any further.
Yeah.
So, was there anything else that happened when you were at Mountain Home that was of significance?
Uh, it was a great tour. So, I mean, we did a lot, and I expected to be there for 3 years. You know, it was one of those things I really wanted to be there for the full 3 years, because in my first 2 years we had, you know, like I said, 2 deployments plus a couple of training deployments. So as I was kind of looking back at it, I realized I was gone a lot. You know, I was gone probably more than a year of the 2 years I ended up being there. And the reason I was only there for 2 years ended up being that I ended up getting the assignment to Kadena, or actually it was to Yokota. But the way that kind of happened was one day I was walking down, my squadron commander by then was Mitch Fritter, and walking down the hallway, I was still a flight commander, and Fritter was walking the other way, and he goes, "Oh, hey, Marco, I forgot. I just remembered I was at the OG meeting, and somebody said that you're getting orders to Japan." And I'm like, really? Because I haven't even been here 2 years yet. It couldn't be me. And I was thinking, well, maybe you get confused with, there was another guy in the squadron named Skinny McKinney, and I'm McCaffrey. I'm like, maybe they meant Skinny. And he goes, oh, that would make a lot more sense, maybe. So yeah, don't worry about it. I'll tell you later if it comes up. So I'm like, okay. So I'd only been there about 19, 20 months at the time, so less than 2 years, which really they hardly ever moved you less than 2 years. So I kind of blew it off, and then a few days later, he goes, "Oh, hey, Marco, remember that Japan thing? No, that's you. I got word you're getting orders to go over to Japan." And I'm like, "What the hell?" So, okay, what is it? And ended up, I was going to be the F-15 operations officer at 5th Air Force, which is at Yokota Air Base in Tokyo. But it's a Recce 8 flying position, so I'd be flying with Kadena down in Okinawa, and for Recce 8 we were required to fly at least 3 times a month. So at least a week a month I'd be going down to Kadena, and then the job was also working with the JASDAF, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, and their F-15 program, and then coordinating and being the liaison for them, as well as everything for the 18th Wing for F-15s in the 5th Air Force area of operations, which was basically all of Japan, down through Okinawa, kind of into the South China Sea, and then up all the way to the Korean Peninsula, but not Korea, because that was a different numbered Air Force. But right along the Korean shore up into basically the Chimkhat Peninsula up there in Russia, and then out to the east of Japan in the Japanese Sea. So that was our AOR. And anyway, so I said, okay, I guess I'm going to Japan. And kind of a funny anecdote, and I don't remember if we talked about it. When I was at Sheikh Isa in Bahrain, we had done an exchange with the carrier that happened to be there, the USS Stennis. And I went and spent a few days on the Stennis working with some F-14 guys. And the host guy that was there was this guy named Spidey Oman, who's a F-14B guy. And anyway, make a long story short, he'd come to Sheikh Isa, and I showed him around F-15s. And when we parted, I said, hey, it's a small world, maybe we'll see each other again. And so he called me about the same time as this was happening, and said, hey, I just got an exchange tour and come to Mountain Home in the F-15. And I'm like, hey, I have a house for sale. And he came up and he bought my house, and we went to Japan.
How did your wife feel about that? Because that's a big deal. And if it's okay for me to say, you've got children, so
right.
schools
3.
and family, friends, and their friends.
Right. I mean, it was, I think, to be honest, my family is awesome. My wife was a super Air Force wife. She loved going to different places. Not that it was always easy or always our choice, and this one wasn't. We loved our place in Mountain Home. We'd actually built the house ourselves when we got there, thinking we would be there for a while. So we had built it, plans and everything, and picked everything out. So it was a hard house to leave, but she was all in, and And so we headed out and we left. I think I had my Finney flight on the 17th of December at Mountain Home, and we headed out to catch the flight out of California to go to Tokyo.
So that sounds like the description you've just given is it's a very F-15 centric job then. So it might not be as good as, well, it wouldn't be as good as just having a pure flying job. But as far as the staff job goes, not too bad.
No, it was about as good as you could get because I still got to fly. And everything I did was related to the F-15. And so when I got there, our office was called 5th Air Force DOO, Directorate of Operations. And so in DOO, we had 4 pilots, and they were one for each of the major systems in the AOR. So, well, not all of them, but me in the F-15, we had a guy, J. Todd Hicks, who was an F-16 weapons officer. He was flying up out of Misawa. And we had a helicopter guy in HH-60 who flew with the rescue squadron down at Kadena. We would go down together as often as we could. And then we had a C-130 pilot who flew with the wing there at Yokota. So between the 4 of us, we covered most of the main systems in the AOR, and we were all active flyers. So we kind of divvied up when we would be gone for a week, a month, and then we would coordinate issues with the Japanese Air Force, depending on weapon systems. So for me, it was pretty easy because the JASDAF had F-15Js, and I would help with those a lot. And the C-130 person was doing C-130s. They flew 60s, so our 60 guy was working with that. For the F-16, they didn't have those. So J. Todd kind of just worked stuff at Misawa, and then anything else that was necessary, like airspace and all kinds of different other issues.
So for a weapons officer, I bet he was pleased with that.
Yeah.
They got I can't remember what it's called. Is it the J2? It's like a little copy of the F-16.
Similar, but it was yes, but they didn't have them yet. And they were still flying just the F4. They had F4Js down in Naha in Okinawa, and had a couple of F4 bases. But mostly Eagles and F4s was pretty much the Marine State Fighters. And then they had a couple of other Mitsubishi kind of homegrown Japanese aircraft, the F1, but not the French F1. It was a Japanese F1. And those are all gone now, but replaced by the FJ2, which is basically an S-16 lookalike.
So what was the purpose then of your supporting the JASDAF with their F-15? I mean, what kind of things were you helping them with?
Well, there were several things, and it was funny when I first got there. One of the first things they told me was, we had a vault, obviously, with all the U.S. classified stuff in it. But in the vault were several file cabinets, and they were kind of filled with information by topic, which was funny because basically the people who'd been around for a long time, we had some civilians that worked continuity for us, and they'd go, "Oh yeah, hey, they basically the JASDAF come back with the same issue every 3 years." Because they figured there'll be new people and the answer might be different. And so some of them were unique and some of them were new. And the ones that I worked the most, and it had come up several times, one of them was air refueling for the JASDAF. And I'll talk a little bit about why they wanted to do it in a second. But and then another was active missiles. So now they were kind of interested in how do we maybe get it an AIM-120 capability. And then night vision goggles. They were interested in night vision goggles. And then some airspace things that were just kind of routinely popped up. So it was funny. Anytime you got something from the JASDAF, the secretary guy that was a civilian, he'd go, "Oh yeah, hey, go look in the file cabinet. It's under airspace," and you go pull out the file and look at, okay, 3 years ago they asked, 6 years ago they asked, and so you go, okay, we remember what we said last time. But they were doing some interesting stuff. And so air refueling was one that I ended up working right away. And the funny thing about the Japanese was after World War II, they'd been their constitution forced them into be a defensive only force. And so they took that to heart. And actually F-15Js, the air refueling section of the Eagle was removed. The plumbing internal, I think some of it was still there. but there was a plate, an actual plate over the top of where the air refueling receptacle goes. So it was riveted down. I mean, so that you couldn't open it. It was unopenable. And so they took that pretty seriously. But they were very interested in getting off island, outside of Japan, to do some training. And one of the things they really wanted to do was a Cope Thunder up in Alaska. And they knew that they couldn't get to Alaska from Japan without air refueling. And so that's why they kept coming back to us and saying, hey, is there a way we could, maybe just get some kind of air refueling training to get a couple of jets up to Alaska for a Cope Thunder? And it was political to a large extent inside the JASDAF. And our answer was always, well, yeah, we could do that. It's not that hard, but you have to get approval, and then we could set up a training program. So the answer kind of was always the same, but they never did it at the time. And so they were looking at that again when I was working with them. And again, I think the answer was the same. But as I started thinking about it, I told them, your biggest problem is political, and your political problem is you're not asking for it the right way. Getting air refueling capability to go to Cope Thunder is a waste of time. You need to come up with a defensive reason to have air refueling. And so I started kind of helping them formulate the concept of not using air refueling for force projection, but for force sustainment. And so that you could compound your capability of you have your Air Force by not having to land because you keep running out of gas while you're doing lane defense. And that started to kind of, I think, spin the wheels with them. And so we started working on that a lot. And then one of the other things that I did right away, and this had to do with, again, trying to get to Cope Thunder, was they decided, and I ended up becoming the project officer for the first Cope North Guam exercise, where we took a section of JASDAF F-15Js to Guam to do an exercise over there.
You mentioned off camera last time around that you had created 2 lanes to provide the
that was later, yeah.
It was later, yeah. Okay. Can you skip to that now, or is it?
Sure. So yeah, this was later. So the Cope North Guam ended up being an exercise with the Dirty Dozen. So when I was in the 12th, the 12th came and did that one. So the 12th ended up deactivating at Kadena and moved to Alaska. And so I moved to the Cox after that, the 67th Fighter Squadron, attached with them. And so the 67th actually did a Cope North up in Chitose, up in Hokkaido, up in northern Japan later. We were working with Misawa, the F-15Js out of Chitose, and us. We took, I think we had 6 or 10, 12, something like that. F-15Cs we brought up from Okinawa to Chitose. And for that exercise, this was later, once we started really kind of developing these concepts. And so we brought some tankers up, and we set up some lanes for defensive. It was a Korean defensive exercise. So we were flying out over the Sea of Japan between Japan and Korea mainly. And so we set it up where we could come in and basically get the JASDAF to have to scramble and get up off the ground. But then the bandits would just depart. They wouldn't let them engage. So they would actually have to commit, because they'd meet commit criteria, but they'd drag out before the engagement happened. And so that basically the JASDAF was running out of gas, and they'd have to recover, and they didn't even get to fight. And we were in the next lane over, and we were doing the same thing, but we would just go hit the tanker, and then we'd go back out. And the next time they came in, we got to fight. So we'd come down and debrief, here was what we did with our fight. And they'd be like, dang, we didn't get to fight. I'm like, well, if you would have went to the tanker, you couldn't. So we started kind of showing them practically that the tanker for a defensive scenario was incredibly useful, because it extends the ability of your force, right? So if you don't have to go back and land because you still got all your weapons, you don't have to scramble more aircraft, and you basically increase the amount of airplanes that you have through air refueling, which we always knew, but they weren't thinking of it that way for their defense only constitution.
So did that provide them with the silver bullet that allowed them to make the case?
It did, and we did one more exercise, and this again was later, called Keen Edge. Keen Edge is a big Korean focused exercise for the JASDA, and we did it again in a much larger scale, and proved it, bigger. And that I think made a big impression on their Air Force and their senior leaders in their Air Force, because Kobe North up at Chitose is kind of a local that base exercise. But Keen Edge is kind of a Japan-wide exercise. So a lot more people are looking at that. And I think they did get a lot out of that. And the proof is in the pudding. They have air refueling now. They ended up buying a 767 based variant tanker. I think they got their first ones in 2009. So this was back in 2001. So it took them a little while to actually acquire it, but they have them now. So I think I take credit for that.
or you're to blame, depending on who's talking.
Yeah.
So what did you think of the Japanese F-15 guys then? Were they, it's interesting talking to people who do exchange tours, and there are some nations flying the F-15 where people come back and they don't have anything nice to say. In fact, there are some nations flying the F-16 where people come back and they don't have anything nice to say. But what was your take on the quality of their flying and their work ethic and so on?
Yeah, well, their work ethic was huge. One of the things that I saw, and I think it tied a little bit into that air refueling discussion too, was you kind of think of the Japanese as a warrior culture, which they were. But after the defeat in World War II, I think they really kind of went off that a little bit, where they were like, hey, we still are proud, and they were great people. I loved the Japanese. I loved living in Japan. The people were fantastic, super great people. But their warrior ethic was undertoned. They were almost afraid to show it. And so one of the things that I would say about that is when I was talking to some guys at Kobe North Guam, which is where I really got a chance to sit down and hang out and brief and debrief with fighter pilots. And we were talking about air refueling because they knew that that's something that we were considering looking into in the future. And one of the guys, I remember, he was kind of a young guy, but he goes, "Is it hard? I mean, I'm not even sure I could do it." And I go, "Dude, it's just flying formation. You guys know how to fly formation. It's just flying formation underneath the tanker, and they stick you. It's not hard." And so when we kind of went through that, where they visualize it, then it wasn't a problem. And so for flying the Eagle, they're great pilots. They didn't employ the aircraft BVR well. And the big thing I would say is they were semi-GCI dependent BVR, and they weren't autonomous. So American fighter pilots are taught to be autonomous. We don't expect to have GCI. If it fails, I still go. I still have to figure out how to do my sort. I still do all my comm. I still need to kill everybody as best I can before the merge, and then kill everybody else after the merge. They seem to be dependent a lot on their GCI to get them into the right area and to get help with their sorts. And then once you got into the merge, they were great at BFM. They were real good. But I think that's what they did the most. I think they being an Air Force that didn't really leave their home, they spent a lot of time flying BFM and ACM. So once you got into the visual fight, they were great. They just weren't super autonomous BVR, and they would miss guys. You could get a single in almost every time. We would do some kind of action when we were red air, and a singleton was almost always in unobserved. So where that just didn't happen to us, the Americans, we didn't let that happen. I mean, it could happen, but it was pretty common with them to miss somebody. So I felt like their BVR long range stuff wasn't as good as ours, but their close in fights were comparable, and they were real good in the visual fight.
Were they cognizant of those differences? I mean, you sort of get the picture from what you're describing that it's a series of compromises on their part. So they know that maybe they could do these things, but they don't because of their constitution or whatever it is that puts them on that defensive footing.
Potentially, and I think maybe some of it is also weapons limited. I mean, again, we had AIM-120 then, and they didn't. They're AIM-7 only, AIM-7, AIM-9. So they're tied a little bit more to carrying the missile all the way in. They don't have, we were Suite 3 at the time. They're not Suite 3. So there could be some capability differences in the aircraft that caused my observation, because it's not the same jet. But they had GCI. I mean, when we were out at Cove North Guam, and every time I flew against them, they had their E2s that were doing their their airborne control. So they should have had. I felt like they should have had as good an SA as we did, and I didn't see it. But again, I mean, I'm comparing them to weapons guys that I'm flying against in the dozen and the 67. And I don't think that's an uncommon thing for most countries I flew against in the F-15. I felt like some of them, we just clubbed like baby seals, even in the visual fight. But in general, most of them were much better at dogfighting with their particular aircraft, whatever its strengths were, than they were and they weren't autonomous, and they didn't think beyond visual range. They lost people, they lost track of people. It was pretty normal to win big in the long range fight from the F-15.
It's interesting you mentioned Suite 3, and it just reminded me of a story. I did once interview somebody when I was writing a book, so not for this podcast. This was years ago, who had flown an exchange tour with the Japanese. Actually, he was still on it. It was coming to the end of it when I was talking to him, and he talked about how they didn't want to not have the latest software loads. So the suite, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is the OFP, the Operational Flight Program. So that's the software that's run on the airplane that gives it many of its capabilities, in addition to the hardware, of course. So he said they would buy the OFP upgrades, but then they wouldn't buy the manuals. They were too tight. Yeah. They were too tight to buy the manuals. He said so they have these capabilities, but they wouldn't know what the HOTAS was to activate them. So the radar could do something, but they didn't know how to make it do it because they hadn't bought the manuals. So
yeah, that's probably true.
Do you, I mean, on that note, can you talk a little bit about software loads and the impact they can have on capabilities? I mean, there is a curious expression nowadays about the F-15, which is it's not your grandfather's F-15, which is, shows how old the airplane is. So from the outside, right, it's pretty much the same, but there's obviously been hardware, and then software is at the heart of everything. How much of an impact can a new OFP suite make, or a new radar tape make?
Well, the difference between Suite 2 and Suite 3 was pretty big. I mean, there was a lot of new, not major capabilities. I mean, basically the airplane still was mech'd about the same, but it was better. Everything was just better, and it worked better, and it held locks better. It sorted better. It just worked the weapons better. Everything was better. There weren't a whole lot of different new capabilities, Suite 2 to Suite 3, just better. I would say that after about the time I was leaving, when we're bringing in AIM-9X and JAHEMX and a bunch of other, really kind of game changer capabilities, where off-bore side AIM-9 shots, being able to kind of queue with the helmet-mounted queue, those were huge, and I didn't live it. So maybe I flew your grandfather's F-15, but yeah, some of the stuff with the HOTAS, and again, I think maybe I was a little bit ahead by going through Mountain Home, because when I left Tyndall in some of the oldest C models with the APG-63, no JTIDs, all that kind of stuff. When I went to Mountain Home, the airplane was way different. We had the APG-70, which ran a different suite than the APG-63. It was actually, for even the air-to-air roll, was a little bit different. And when we got the Suite 3, it enhanced that. So when I got to Kadena, now I'm flying APG-63 Suite 3, which was it was basically the same as the APG-70 prior to adding Suite 3. It kind of brought it up to that. And there was a few other things that were equal to the APG-70, so it was pretty similar. But I didn't have AISA, and so there was a lot of things that came up after I left that I know about, but I don't have experience with.
You mentioned, I think, in our last interview that you want to be flying a certain amount per month, a certain amount per
Mhm.
week, and you referenced 15 minutes or so ago that you would fly maybe
Yeah,
one week out of four with the guys at
right.
Kadena. What was that experience like then? And I mean, I'm curious to know whether or not
Yep.
you would get to the squadron and feel rusty. I mean, before you even step, you don't feel
Yeah.
like you're ahead of the power curve.
There was occasionally times like that. When I was with the dozen before it closed, I was flying quite a bit because I would actually, well, I left, like I mentioned that I left Mountain Home in December. So my last flight was middle of December. I didn't get to Tokyo until January, and I didn't get down to Kadena the first time till February. So it was a couple of months. And when I got down in February, I didn't get to fly because I was showing up for the first time. So I did a couple of sims. I did some local area sims. So I made sure, I touched some controls and did that. And then when I came back in March was my first time I flew. And I think I did one local area. So actually, I flew with Clouseau, the first one. He was my IP. But I think I must have, I didn't fly a D model. So he must have just chased me to get my landing currency back up. So I felt pretty rusty that day. I remember that. I did a simulator the day before we flew, and then we flew. And then after that, they were going into a surge, and I actually their scheduler there at the time, this guy Not So Cool, which became a good friend of mine. But I'd call Not So and say, "Hey, I'm coming down," or "When's the next surge?" Because that's when I'm coming. And so I kind of planned to always come down the week of a surge, which gets you 3 sorties a day. So if I could come for a week, I could get about 9 sorties a week. And of course, I wasn't flying for 3 weeks, sometimes maybe four between. But if you could get 9 in a week, that was pretty good. By the end of the 9 sorties, I felt like I was back to where I ought to be, and then I was leaving for a month. So yeah, it wasn't great. I didn't like that part of it, but and I may have mentioned, and this is one of the reasons that even though I was a mission commander qualified type guy, I almost always flew on the wing when I came down to Kadena. I was just a very experienced wingman. So when we'd go do 2v2s or 4v4s, I mean, I want to say that people were like, "Hey, you can come, you can be my number 4," because having an 1800-hour, multi-tour Eagle guy as number 4 is pretty good, even if he hasn't flown in a couple of weeks. So I got to fly quite a bit. When the dozen closed, to go up to Alaska, and we only had 2 Eagle squadrons left at Kadena, and I came over to the Cox. Then I didn't get to as much flying, and it was largely because a lot of the guys from the dozen that hadn't PCS'd yet, they kind of infiltrated the 2 other squadrons, so we kind of had too many people. And when there's too many pilots, the dude that only comes down once a month is not high priority. So I was only getting maybe the 3 I was required a month, unless we were deployed, unless I joined someplace. Like when I went up to Chitose to support that Code North, I got several sorties that week. But yeah, not as much as I'd like. And when the weather's crappy and you haven't flown in a month, and that first one is 301, and you're in the weather all the way up, that's pretty sucky. But it was okay. I would rather do it than not do it. But there was days I was definitely not on my A game on the first one.
What rank were you? And if I may ask, how old were you at this time?
I was about 32, 33. I was a major. And actually, yeah, I was a major the whole time. So
Okay.
I pinned on major there. I had been promoted already, but pinned on at Yokota shortly after I got there. Mark.
What was the airspace like in Japan? I mean, are they geared to the military flying exercises? The one thing I've
Yeah.
noticed recently is, I say recently, over the last few years. I mean, there was an F-18 crash, and he hit the tanker, and there was an SH-60 that dropped a door or something. And from the media that I've seen, it feels like the people of Japan are not that keen on those sorts of things. Did you get a lot of restrictions on airspace? Could you do what you wanted?
Out of Kadena, we could do almost anything we wanted. And the reason was because when you take off out of Kadena, in about 15 seconds, you're over the water. And then once you're over the water, all of our main airspace was all over the water. So it was surface to infinity, supersonic everywhere. So the airspace was really good. It just, you're not over land. So there's no good visual references. When you try to fly low, there's no land, and so it's kind of, to some extent, I guess, kind of like being in the Navy, being off a carrier, except for your base isn't that far away. It's not blue water ops where you can't get to land. You can always get back, but everything you do is out over the water. So chaff, flare, supersonic, it was actually really good compared to Mountain Home, where everything I did was pretty much over land, and we did have some of those restrictions. Or because it's Mountain Home, the AGL elevation over some of our airspace was 5,000 feet. So, even 5,000 feet for your mid altitude is now 10 to maybe 12, 15,000 feet. So performance wise, there's a big difference between 5 and 10,000 feet on the engines. So you could actually get down there and do stuff at lower levels and get everything you could out of the jet. So I liked that. The airspace there was actually good. And then we would do some stuff up in Korea. When we were flying up in Japan, like up in Chitose, we had a lot of restrictions up over mainland Japan, mostly noise and stuff. And then there was a lot of problems. That didn't come out right. Not problems with the Okinawans. There was, some people may not know this. The Okinawans and the Japanese weren't always friendly. And so there was a lot of things that the Okinawans would say in public about the Americans because they were needling Tokyo, not really against us. And they would kind of say that. They'd go, hey, we're going to put this out. Don't worry about it. We're not really mad at you guys, but we have to say something. Now, of course, there were things with, largely it was Marines, not usually airmen, but incidents with women and stuff like that downtown that weren't good and that caused bad relations between the Americans and the Okinawans, because that was tension between, the two. But a lot of stuff we heard was more Okinawa versus Tokyo to some extent. But they did build, I know we built a wall while I was there, a noise abatement wall between the airfield and a little section of town that I don't think probably did a lot, but maybe they were happier with it.
Can we talk a little bit about the threat then? So you've obviously got, you mentioned that a different numbered air force is responsible for Korea, but Korea is not very far away. There's the possibility of China coming down the Taiwan Straits. I mean, what was the realistic view then as to what would happen if either of those kicked off?
Yeah, well, Kadena had a responsibility to go up to Korea. We would work some stuff with the Japanese themselves, but largely the JASDAF was going to do a lot of that. And we had an alert location up at Gwangju, up in the southern tip of Korea, that we practiced going to out of Kadena. So yeah, we would go up there. And, there was different war plans, obviously, and I can't talk about the specifics, but in the Pacific, the Korean war plan was pretty much an all-out effort. So there were a lot of people that were going to be coming in, and they were going to be coming in all over, in Japan, in Okinawa, and up into the peninsula. So everybody had their location and their priorities. And we practiced that a lot. Obviously, with 5th Air Force, Japan's primary threat was that potentially Korean scenario. And so we worked. That was what they were most interested in, and what we worked with them a lot on.
You mentioned obviously a 23-to-1 kill ratio in Red Flag, helpful against an adversary like Korea that maybe not be technically advanced, but has the numbers.
Right.
What would within the realms of the unclassified, what would that have looked like? I mean, would you have had to have brought in lots more Eagles to make sure you could do it?
I don't know if we needed a lot more. There was a lot of assets on Korea already. So if you bring the 3 squadrons of F-15s up from Okinawa, as well as assets off carriers. There's obviously a lot of carrier capabilities that would be moving in. Japan is one of the only countries in the world that's not the U.S. that had a carrier station. The Kitty Hawk was stationed in Japan, so that was always available. So I don't know. I can't remember the specific amount of assets that would be coming in to support. I mean, there were some, definitely, but with the F-15Js, I mean, they had, I think, 12 squadrons or something like that of F-15Js arrayed across their nation, plus their F-4Js, and so they had, you know, a pretty decent Air Force. And we expected them to be there. You know, if they're defending themselves, we would be helping. That was our job, but they ought to be doing part of it themselves. And then, of course, we had the F-16s up in Misawa too, so they would be involved. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of plans for a lot of stuff to be coming over. But yeah,
was there any at that time? And I just don't know, so I'm not asking because I already sort of feel like I know the answer. But at that time, you know, there is some tension, isn't there, over islands in the middle of the sea, which you know, China has claimed ownership of, and Japan refutes that.
right.
Was that kind of stuff going on at the time? You know, did China factor into their thinking as to potential conflict?
Yeah, I mean, China was always. Back then it wasn't. I mean, it's more now, but back then it was always something, you know, to be concerned about, and those things were going on then too, and of course, you know, Japan fought several pretty major wars with China over its history, so it was one of those kind of ancient hatred enemies that they didn't like to deal with, and they knew that Okinawa was the closest place to China, and so if you had a China scenario, it's a different scenario to some extent for the U.S., but for Japan, they're probably going to still have to deal with the Korean access point because Korea and China were allies, at least North Korea. So there was a lot of intermixing between those thought processes, and we kind of worked with both sides. I don't know if you can hear that. I apparently just got about 100 emails. But anyway, so yeah, we were interested in that stuff too, and that was one of the reasons that they wanted to develop the air refueling capability after we started developing it and talking about it, because they're like, oh, well, that could help us a lot down there. And also they wanted to integrate, and I was part of some development of a new AWACS for them too, because the E2s were getting pretty old in the tooth, and they wanted something with more capability. And so I think that what they ended up with is actually a combo. It's a new AWACS tanker combo, which is good for them.
Do you want to shut that off?
I think it's over.
Well, it's a denial of service attack.
No, it's actually I bumped the mouse in my computer. I woke up and it's telling me all my email I got for the last couple hours.
Okay. So with regards to China, and again, you may just pass on the question, which is fine, of course. But you know, there is there is an electronic attack plan that someone like China will have. You know, they're gonna come at you, and they're gonna deny you your ability to network and do all the things that you've talked about in the series of our interviews. You know, sort of data linking, sensor fusion from off platforms, from other assets, comms jamming, all that kind of stuff. When you train, do you ever train to that? Do you ever say, okay, well, you're going to pretend that your radar can't see someone at this range and it can only see them at this range, or that you're going to have range only, or azimuth only, but no range? Or
yeah, in the jet, that's hard to do. We do it in the simulator, so we can simulate those type of threats, and then you get it right. So what you see is based on those threat capabilities. So it's easier to do in the simulator. than in the jet, because it's hard to pretend you don't see something. But in the simulator, I can make it so I can't see it, right? So that you do get it last minute, and then you learn, oh crap, if they're doing that, I'm going to get a late picture or no picture, or somebody's going to show up at the merge. So that I think is how we work to kind of develop those skill sets. It's just hard in the air to do that. And some of that, I mean, I wasn't flying, but I did it later. I was at PACOM. I was working for the admiral there, and I did strategy. And some of that stuff, most of the China stuff was happening then, because when I was at PACOM was when they did their ASAT shot and took down a satellite. So we were learning that they were growing in capabilities. But while I was at Fifth, I was part of a team that called FETAT, Far East Tactics Analysis Team, that took a lot of intelligence sensors that were watching adversary nations do their own training, and then coming back. And so they needed a fighter pilot to listen to the comms. And basically I would draw out what they were doing based on the intercepted communications. And we could tell kind of with some analysts, linguists and analysts, are they getting better? What are they doing? What are they training? Are they getting good at it? Are their capabilities getting better or worse? And that was really interesting. So had a great opportunity to be part of that, and then pass that back out, via training opportunities to the CAF, to the combat air forces. Like, hey, here's what we're seeing that they're actually doing, and their success rates and such.
What was your view as a professional military aviator then on those sorts of sort of simulated outcomes? So if you knew how many of something somebody had and what its capabilities were, and then you also had the other missing piece of the puzzle, which was how good are they at doing it or using it. This is what day 1, day 2, day 3 would look like. And the reason I ask is because it seems like all military predictions are grossly wrong. So, Desert Storm as an example, I don't remember the figure off the top of my head. Maybe you do because you were there and you did it. But there were going to be massive losses in the first.
We were going to get what? I mean, they were going to be really good, and we were going to lose a bunch of jets. Yeah.
So having then seen what the process is, having done this sort of analysis of these sort of secret intercepts, do you sort of look at it and still think it's a little bit of a sort of black magic, or is there some method to it?
I think there's method to it, but I think you never know what it's really going to be like until you start experiencing it. One of the other things I did when I was at SAS, our School of Advanced Air Power Studies, we were invited as a class. There was only 27 of us, but we were invited as a class to augment the futures game. So this was right after 9/11. So it would have been 2000. Might have still been in 2001, maybe early 2002. Anyway, we were, or not 2000. Yeah, 2000. Anyway, we went, and they built 2 scenarios, and it was a China scenario. But they said, okay, we're going to be going to war against China, and in one scenario, it's going to be the Air Force we have. And in scenario 2, it's this future Air Force that had all these weapons that we don't have. And I'm like, okay, well, how can you pretend to know what weapons you don't have are going to actually do? But okay, we'll see. So it was space weapons and all this stealth capability that was, we were getting, but it wasn't really fielded. All that stuff wasn't out yet. Hypersonic missiles and stuff. And of course, at the end of the exercise, the future Air Force won, right? So I'm like, couldn't we have just postulated that? Because we wasted a week. And if we would have found at the end of this exercise that it didn't work, would we go, okay, well, screw it, we're not going to do any of that? I mean, come on. So I felt like there was a lot of effort. It was a major high-level exercise with a lot of high-powered people. And I'm like, I could have written the report before we did it. to a large extent, just based on tell me what you think these weapons can do, and I'll tell you what I think is going to be the outcome. But I still think there's value in it to some extent, because you have to at least run simulations to see how that will work. But when you do that, I think the most critical thing is the assumptions you put into the system, right? So if your assumption, for example, in the Pacific is that they're not going to take out any of our comms, that's a pretty bad assumption, and because it forces you into not preparing for things that you probably ought to be ready for, with extra, redundant capabilities and such. And I felt like sometimes we did that, where yeah, maybe the weapons part was okay, but the assumptions were overly broad, or sometimes so off that it's not realistic. Not to maybe the engagement level, but at the operational and strategic level.
What came next?
Okay, so yeah, I ended up staying at Kadena, working there. Actually, I was only there for about 18 months, which was a little unfortunate. As I said, I got promoted. And when I got promoted, I was also selected for intermediate service school in residence. So for the Air Force, that meant I was going to school. And that was at Maxwell Air Force Base. So I left there in the summer of 2000 and went to Maxwell Air Force Base for Air Command and Staff College. And then while I was at Air Command and Staff College, I applied for and ended up getting selected for our School of Advanced Air Power Studies, which I kind of mentioned a second ago, which was a follow-on master's degree program to become an air power strategist. So while I was doing those things is when 9/11 actually happened. On September 11th in 2001, I was a SAS student. I remember that day vividly. I was driving to work, and I heard on the radio, just between songs, it was almost just a casual, hey, there's been an airplane crashed into the World Trade Center. And so as a pilot, my first thought was, oh my gosh, the weather must be terrible, and I wonder if it was a civilian that was off course, or how did an airliner get vectored into a building in bad weather? So all these things are kind of going through my mind as I'm driving into the parking lot. And so I got out of the car, walked in the building, and as I kind of turned a corner, there was 3 or 4 guys standing around a television set, and I saw the first tower, the second tower hadn't been hit yet, but the first tower is burning, and the sky is clear, and I knew immediately that's not an accident. It couldn't have been an accident. You don't run into a building by accident like that. And then I saw the second one hit, and of course that changed a lot going forward for our course. I mean, we learning air power strategy, and not necessarily, although they had classes in the small war and terrorism and those kind of things, they it took on a new flavor as we finished that. And so while that was going on, before I got my SAS slot, I actually had an assignment to NORAD. My wife is from Colorado Springs, so it was kind of hey, I know I have to go to the S word after school, so let's do something for the family. And if I can get to NORAD, they have a air sovereignty mission there. My F-15 time is valuable there. I can hopefully get into ops or plans and help support NORAD. So I had already gotten the position, and when I got SAS, that fell off. And so I was still trying to figure out how do I get back to NORAD as a staff officer. And I had brought it up to the SAS leadership, and at the time they kind of called NORAD SNORAD, because nothing was going on. Well, after 9/11, that was no longer the case. And so I was selected to go to NORAD and help develop Homeland Air Defense doctrine and operational stuff for Operation Noble Eagle with the US and Canada for a couple of years. And so I was there as we brought on U.S. Northcom and a lot of other changes that happened in the U.S. as well as with North American Aerospace Defense Command. So, I mean, we could talk a little bit about that if you want, or we can move on to another flying job. But while I was there, I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, pinned on, and then selected for command. And that's when I ended up going to the T6 to be an initial cadre to bring the T6 into the Air Force.
Can we just talk about NORAD just for a little bit? I think
sure.
Getting to the T6 would be good, and I know we're once again running short on time. But so Noble Eagle, as you just referenced, was that the response to the sort of shutting down of airspace to protect it from any further airliners, and then that continued for many. Does it continue to today?
I don't know if it's technically still going on, but it went for a long time. If it is, it's still part of the Guard. The Guard is the primary for the U.S. The Air Guard is our primary folks for doing air sovereignty anyway. So it'd be largely a Guard mission run out of CONAR, which is a continental NORAD region that's run out of Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida.
And so the idea is that if any aeroplane comes along again, well, this is a scenario, and threatens to do the same again, crash into somewhere, you're going to shoot it down before it manages to do that.
Yeah, well, that's theoretically the plan. I was part of helping develop General Eberhardt's testimony to the 9/11 Commission, and one of the things that we talked about a lot was. Because, of course, Congress looked at it and said, how did this happen? How did we let it happen? Why didn't we shoot him down? And, well, there was a lot of reasons for that. And most of them were that nobody was looking at an internal threat. There was, by origin, not a threat, right? So there was nobody's mission that monitored U.S. airlines to see if they're going to decide to crash into things. So that hadn't really been contemplated. And so one of the things that General Eberhardt told Congress was, what would my testimony look like if we shot down a civilian airliner and you were wondering if it was actually hijacked or wondering if it was going to be crashed? Or what if the aircraft that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the Todd Raider guys that rushed the cockpit, what if they succeeded and flew it back and landed it? But we shot it down because we couldn't talk to them. There's so many what ifs, and that particular mission set is a chocolate mess of potential failure in every way. Added that even if we did shoot something down, what if it went down then in a worse place than if we let it go to the target, like in the middle of the city instead of into a military facility, which obviously both are bad. But one could eventually be worse. And to me, it was personal. I mean, the co-pilot in Flight 93 that went down in Shanksville was a good friend of mine, Leroy Homer. He was an academy next door neighbor. We were went to the academy together, and so we were really good friends then, and went different ways in our Air Force careers. But yeah, when I found out, a good buddy of mine was dead that day flying for American Airlines instead of the Air Force, it was tough. But I still, that whole ROE for shooting down a civilian airliner, even if it's hijacked, is a conundrum and something that we had to wrestle with and figure out and build procedures for. But I hope we never have to do it. I really hope we never have to do it.
Without getting into the specifics then of the decision-making process or the matrix, is it in your view robust enough then that the person who's going to have to pull the trigger or hit the pickle button, can feel confident they can do it?
Yeah, I think I was saying there's a ton of steps in it before you get to fulfill the ROE enough to shoot. So I hope so. But again, even with that, and when we did kind of exercise scenarios to play that out at NORAD when I was there, the results weren't always, what we'd hope. And again, sometimes it was that the crap that we shot it down, but it hit Ottawa, So instead, maybe it was trying to hit a military target. And this was, I think, one of the biggest conundrums is do you let the thing hit the military target? Or how do you shoot it down so it doesn't hit and cause other destruction? And have you condemned the passengers to death, potentially, when that may not happen? What if the terrorist decides, I don't want to die for Allah today? I guess I'm assuming it's Islamic. That's probably bad. But there again, that is a mission set that yes, we're prepared to do. Again, I hope we never have to do it. And yes, the criterion to get to that point is very robust, but man, I don't know. I don't know if it's a good one. It's kind of like you asked, about going on a nuclear strike. I kind of never figured I'd get there. I think this one's a no-lose situation, or a no-win, kind of a no-win situation too.
That was going to be my next question. Is there a parallel between that and the idea you would go and drop a nuclear weapon on a target? So, and whether or not you really give it much thought ahead of time, or if you just say, well, I'll deal with those emotions or those thought processes when I get there.
I think it's probably tougher to shoot down a civilian airliner. We're not at war with the people who are in there. I think I would be tougher.
You mentioned a minute ago that you never looked inwardly. The threat was never within; it was without. Can you talk a little bit about that then? The Russian propensity for coming along and testing response times up in Alaska, and even sometimes just transiting down the coast, down past Florida to Cuba.
Yeah. I mean, and that still occurs. In the F-22 area, we got F-22s up in Alaska. I've seen pictures recently of F-22s next to bears. But yeah, they would test. I don't know that they were messing with us as much as just practicing flying. And then, of course, we would do the same thing, right? We would fly over there and get close and see what they come up and do. I think some important things happened over the years where we got better at communicating those kind of things, so that it wasn't necessarily dangerous all the time. It didn't mean that we didn't scramble because they didn't tell us. We did, and we do. But I think we built some procedures and some inter-aircraft communication capabilities with wiggling your wings and stuff like that have helped keep us from having problems. I don't know if you remember, we had a midair with a Chinese fighter and I think it was a P3.
P2.
Or one of our
aircraft. EP3.
Yeah, it could have been an EP3. Anyway, so I mean, those kind of international incidents are bad, and when you're close to other people's places, the possibility goes up. And so I don't blame them for doing some training, and I don't think they blame us when we do it either.
Did you see, speaking of which, did you see recently, probably a year or so ago, the video of the Su-27 getting very, very close to the F-15? So it was a Lakeheath F-15, and I don't know what they were doing. They were out in the Baltics in international airspace. What did you think of that?
I mean, again, I've been intercepted by other folks before, mostly when I was in the 111. I didn't get intercepted by people much in the Eagle that I didn't know about. When I was in the 111, every once in a while we'd get intercepted by, a lot of times, like the French and other folks who are flying through their country. So again, I don't think it's necessarily completely uncommon, and usually not in international airspace to get that close without talking to each other and without coordinating. But so they were really close. I think they were being a little, provocative. But of course, when you're on the wing, you can't really shoot each other, right? So yeah, it's a tense moment. But I'd be more worried if they were camping out in my 6, with a spike on, than kind of coming up right next to me. That seems almost more like communication than a threat to some extent, even though it's still provocative.